A quote I wanted to share with you. I believe that the government that governs best is a government that governs least. And by these standards, we've set up a fabulous government in Iraq. So now I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Lev Weitz is our next speaker. And perhaps it's his Midwestern roots or whatever, but he's one of the most humble people that we've run into here at the weekends. He gave me almost nothing about himself to say. He would have just said humbly, "Here I am, your speaker." But I did some research. I took this as a challenge. So here we are. Lev Weitz, assistant professor at Catholic University of America. You'll notice the Pope made a special visit to see him a few weeks ago. Went to Catholic University, right? Got his doctorate from Princeton University. He is fluent in multiple dead languages and loves football. So ask your sports questions in Aramaic to him in the question and answer period. He's currently working on a book that examines the formation of Christian communities in the medieval Middle East and their relation with Islam. Of course, he is a medieval Middle East scholar. It focuses on law and society and also on non-Muslims in Islamic societies. Some of his recent works include Polygyny and East Syrian Law, Shaping East Syrian Law in Abbasid Iraq, Al-Ghazali, how would you pronounce that properly? Bar Hebraeus, and The Good Wife, which I think he's trying for an Emmy on this one. But anyway, it's great pleasure I introduce Lev Weitz.
Thanks. Thanks a lot for that introduction. It was all false humility anyway, so it's just as well you said all that. All right, thanks to FPRI for having me here. Thanks for everyone to come and listen. So, everyone can hear me okay, right? Yeah? Okay, so in August 2014, as the Islamic State militants were conquering ever-widening chunks of northern Iraq, among the most distressing reports that came out of the region concerned the plight of an Iraqi religious community called the Yazidis. For several days that August, reports that tens of thousands of men, women, and children fleeing the ISIS advance were besieged on an inhospitable mountain raised the specter of genocide. And what made the situation really even more poignant was this is in the same eastern Anatolian hill country where Christian religious minorities had been nearly exterminated 100 years before by Ottoman forces. So never-ending strife seemed to be the defining theme of non-Muslims in the Middle East, and little-known groups like the Yazidis were thrust into the international spotlight by events like these. So even though the Syrian civil war and ISIS's emergence have made religious minorities central to questions of what the Middle East is, where it's going, what its societies are going to look like, a lot of outside observers haven't really known what to make of these groups pretty often. So, for example, the lead sentence of a New York Times article from August 2014 was that, quote, "The Yazidis are a religious minority of about 500,000 people whose ancient monotheistic faith has roots in Zoroastrianism and beliefs involving a 12th century mystic and a peacock angel." So, all right, fine, well and good. What does that actually tell any of us about what these communities actually look like, what their social lives are like, and what they really mean for the Islamic Middle East? So today, I'm going to try to go into a bit more depth on who exactly these non-Muslim religious communities in the modern Middle East are. I'm going to try to disentangle the narrative of unending woe that so frequently seems to be their lot, and to emphasize a variety of ways that religious minorities themselves have responded to the big transformations in the Middle East's political landscape over the last 100 years or so that we've seen our other speakers talk about, and really how they've tried to find a place for themselves in a drastically transformed Middle East after the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. So to this end, the talk is going to be divided into 3 sections today. First, I'm going to talk generally about who the various religious minorities in the region are, where they live, and what are the features of their religious traditions that make them distinctive and notable. After that, we're going to look at a few case studies from the 20th century to examine some different strategies that religious minorities have taken in order, again, to find spaces within the modern state system of the 20th century medieval Middle East. And then finally, time permitting, I'll try to say a few words about the current conditions of non-Muslims in the region and some prospects for the future. So, first of all, who are the minorities, the religious minorities of the medieval Middle East? So, a few points of definition and a note on who I'm not going to talk about here. So when we talk about minorities, right, we're characterizing communities in terms of demographics. We're talking about religious groups who make up only small percentages of the populations of the states in which they live. In some states of the modern Middle East, like Bahrain or Iraq, for example, the Sunni Muslims, who are the majority of the population elsewhere, are minorities, right? So here in Iraq, for example, and if you look at this map, this is a color-coded demographic map according to religious adherents of the modern Middle East. And as you can probably guess, the green is all Islam, and so is this purplish blue down here. And the darker the green you get, the more Shiite an area gets, and the lighter the green is, the Sunnier it is. So I'm not going to talk about situations in which Sunnis are minorities within their current national boundaries. And for the most part, I'm also not going to talk about the specific Shiite group that is the majority religion of Iran and Iraq. I'm going to mainly be concerned with talking about some smaller non-Muslim groups and some other groups that we can sort of consider peripheral Muslim groups or marginal Muslim groups, for lack of a better term. So to start off with, Christians, various Christian groups today make up the biggest chunk of the non-Muslim religious communities of the Middle East. Each one of these Christian groups that I have up here, and I'll talk a little bit about each one, has a distinct history, a distinct literary and religious tradition, each of them differentiating one from the other. And each one of these distinct traditions has roots that go back into the Middle East from before the time that Islam came on the scene, before the time that Islam became the both ruling and the majority religion of the population of the region. So we're going to start out here with the Coptic Christians, or Coptic Christianity, who are most likely the single biggest non-Muslim minority in the region, making up 10%, roughly, perhaps, of Egypt's 80-some million inhabitants. So Coptic Christianity, and some of you may know this, but I want to kind of go through this. I think there might be some worthwhile points for teaching in here as well. So Coptic Christianity being sort of the Egyptian church and the indigenous Christian community of Egypt. One of the most distinctive features of this religious tradition is that they use the Coptic language as one of the main liturgical languages and one of the main literary languages of their religious tradition. So Christians in modern Egypt are all native Arabic speakers, just like the Muslim Egyptians. But this definitive language that defines their religious tradition is actually the latest version of languages that have been spoken in Egypt for millennia. So the Coptic language is a descendant of the same language that would have been written in hieroglyphics millennia ago. And I don't know what your students, I don't know if hieroglyphics impress your students, but this is something that makes my students pay attention to some degree anyway. So Coptic Christianity being around 10% of the population of Egypt, and therefore one of the bigger non-Muslim minorities within the medieval, or excuse me, I'm usually talking about the medieval Middle East, within the modern contemporary Middle East. The second group that I'd like to mention here are a few different religious communities or a few different churches that we can blanket under the term Syriac Christianity. So I'll give you three groups here. The Syriac Orthodox and Catholic Christians, groups you might hear called Assyrians or Chaldean Christians, and Maronites. And what each of these religious communities has in common is that their religious traditions, much as Coptic is this kind of definitive religious language for the Christians of Egypt, the Syriac language, which is a version of Aramaic, is the definitive liturgical and used to be literary language, but definitely the definitive liturgical language for these groups of Christians. So Syriac is this particular dialect of Aramaic. This is an ancient Semitic language that is closely related to Arabic, closely related to Hebrew as well. And I teach at a Catholic institution, so this is another get the attention of my students point, right? This means that this is the modern Christian language that's sort of closest to the language that Jesus spoke, right? The groups that, these Syriac Christian groups are mainly concentrated up here, and their numbers are fast diminishing for reasons we'll talk about later, but are concentrated up here in these border regions between Turkey, Syria and Iraq, the exact same regions that you've also heard called Kurdistan here, which is a significant point that we're going to talk about later. So Syriac Orthodox and Syriac Catholics, and then Chaldeans and Assyrians, this has sort of been their traditional homeland up here. And then the Maronites are concentrated, especially down in Lebanon, where there are still significant numbers of Maronite Christians today. Okay, I have two others up here as being important Middle Eastern Christian groups. Greek Orthodox and Greek Catholic Christians. These church communities are theologically in communion with the Greek Orthodox Church in the world more broadly, and also, and then also the Catholic Church. So the Greek Catholics, for example, in the Middle East recognize the Pope as a spiritual leader. Greek Orthodox in the Middle East recognize the Greek Orthodox Patriarch. However, the Middle Eastern communities who we can call Greek Orthodox and Greek Catholic, most of their religious life, just like their daily life, is conducted in Arabic for the most part. Greek plays a certain role in their sort of church life, but this is really more about historical ties than about the identities of these modern communities. They're pretty heavily Arabic. So here I have it's an example of the, what did I put up here? Is this, yeah, from Paul's epistles translated into Arabic, for example. And I would add also then the Armenians, which is an ethnic and religious and Christian religious community, right, whose historical homeland up around in these regions. But they also, many Armenians have a prominent presence in the cities of Syria, Lebanon, generally the Levant, due to the dislocations from this region that World War I ended up causing to these communities. Okay, so that's been, oh yeah, and let me add just about Greek Orthodox and Greek Catholic Christians in the modern Middle East. All Arabic speaking is their native language, essentially, and they tend to be concentrated in Palestine, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon as well, and especially tend to be a pretty urban community. All right, so those various Christian groups being among the most important religious minorities in the modern Middle East. Let me talk now about a few other ones that I've summarized here as Shiite religious minorities. So as Dr. Berkey told us earlier on today, you hear frequently, of course, in the news and all kinds of different media about Sunni-Shiite divides and all this. As Dr. Berkey told us, if we want to really summarize it, break it down to its most important point, the Shiite religious tradition says that religious authority within Islam should really lie with the Prophet Muhammad's family and these certain descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. If you want to break it down to the most minute sort of theological distinction, that's the difference. So historically, one of the developments of that is that, you know, you go generation by generation, and the Prophet Muhammad has more and more descendants, right? So you have to pick which lineage and which group of descendants you're going to follow. So for that reason, Shiite Islam has developed a whole number of various, a number of various versions of it, we can say. And when you hear in the news about Shiites, you're almost always hearing about what we call 12er Shiites, as Dr. Berkey talked about, who follow a certain line of 12 imams. And this is the majority population in Iraq and in Iran. And so for the vast majority of the time, when you're hearing about Shiites in the news, you're hearing about 12er Shiites. But there are other sort of splinter groups that developed historically from this general Shiite orientation within Islam that now form important religious minority groups, especially in Syria and Lebanon. And the two I want to talk about, I'm not really going to talk about the Alevis in Turkey, who Dr. Reynolds mentioned today, but I'd mention the Druze and the Alawites. These are two sects or religious communities that took some of the ideas of Shiism and sort of took them in another direction by focusing again on certain descendants of the Prophet Muhammad's over others, and by adopting sort of theological religious systems where they have these ideas of sort of hidden knowledge that only certain peoples within the community are privy to. So we can sort of group them as religious minorities, again, that have sort of branched off of Shiism, but they've adopted enough sort of distinctive doctrines that oftentimes they're really communities to themselves. And the Druze are especially concentrated in Lebanon and modern Israel as well. And while the Alawites' traditional homeland has been sort of up here in northern Syria, in the mountains along the coast, and some have also moved into Lebanon in the modern period. And we're going to hear more about the Alawites as we go on a little bit here. I'll mention, so we've talked about Christians, and we've talked about some of these important Shiite religious minority groups, and I'll mention a few others because this doesn't exhaust the religious diversity that still persists to a degree within the modern Middle East. So you've heard about the Yazidis, probably from the news, and I won't actually go into telling you more about the peacock angel and these various aspects of their tradition that so confounded that New York Times reporter. But the Yazidis, this is another minority religious group that blends elements from a number of different traditions, also ethnically is mainly Kurdish, and so tends to live over in these borderlands here, right between Iraq and Turkey. Zoroastrianism being the pre-Islamic religion of Iran. There are still a few Zoroastrians in Iran today, although not many. India has a much more prominent Zoroastrian community than Iran does. Jews, for centuries were indigenous Jews in all different corners of the Middle East. Today there are very few communities left in any of the countries outside of Israel with the creation of the State of Israel in the mid-20th century, right? Most Jewish populations in the Middle East ended up in Israel as they were sort of caught between competing nationalisms. A few states, Turkey, Iran, Morocco still has a Jewish community of a certain size, but these are very small. Mandaeans are another very small religious minority living down in southern Iraq, whose religious system has a lot to do with baptism in the waters and the waters of the rivers down there. Okay, so I've given you a sort of pretty fast schematic overview of who some of the different religious minorities within the modern Middle East are. And let me just sum up with a few big points to make out of this. There's religious minorities frequently concentrated in urban areas, or the bigger communities are often in urban areas, and this has partly to do with greater urbanization in the modern era generally. But there are also, you find that there are greater concentrations of these groups in mountainous regions, like the hills that run sort of just inland from the Mediterranean coast, all up and down the western end of the Levant here, and also this eastern Anatolian hill country. These remain places where, insofar as there are religious minorities left, they are concentrated. And this has something to do with the pre-modern history of the region, right? When you have pre-modern states, mountain areas tend to be less interesting for pre-modern states because it takes a lot of resources to actually get the population to pay their taxes or bend to your will, right? And you may not really be able to extract that many resources out of them. So for that reason, these certain mountainous areas over the pre-modern period made for a place where smaller, more heterodox religious communities could sort of concentrate and be a little bit away from the more homogenizing effects of the Ottoman Empire or other big states. And to a certain extent, there's a remnant of that that still persists in the modern Middle East with, again, the concentration of these communities here and up here. There have been a lot of transformations in between, but to a degree that's left over. Okay, that was the two big points I just want to make about the sort of demographic political landscape of the modern Middle East and how it relates to religious minorities. Okay, so moving on now to the second major component of my talk today. Let's focus in on a few cases and major themes in order to illustrate how religious minorities have responded again to these transformations of the political landscape that we've seen in the Middle East over the course of the 20th century and a little earlier. So we've heard about the breakup of empires, the rise of nationalisms, the creation of the modern Middle Eastern state system, and the question is how these religious minorities have sought to slot themselves in and find a place within these various transformations. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the fundamental change that all religious minorities essentially experienced from being subjects of Muslim empires to ostensibly citizens of modern states. We're then going to look a little bit at Syria and the history of a few different religious minorities there as examples of non-Muslims who have sought to embrace broader-based identities that sort of look beyond their own communities within the modern Middle East, especially how a number of Christian groups were especially attracted by Arab nationalism as an identity and a political platform in the 20th century. And then we'll look at Lebanon and the history of mainly the Maronite community there as an example of a religious community that's turned to a more particularist, more defined political and national identity. Okay, so first, this big picture context of the transformation from subject to citizen. We've heard this a few times, but this is a major and important point that I'd like to emphasize here, which is that since the 19th century, non-Muslims' relationships to politics and to the states in the Middle East in which they live has really been completely transformed from anything that had come before for centuries. From the period of Ottoman reforms in the 19th century and then going down into the creation of modern Middle Eastern states after World War I, up until the point of the Ottoman reforms of the 19th century and the later developments out of that, the relationship of non-Muslims to the state was governed by a framework that we can call the dhimma system. Now, according to this system, which means something like the Pact of Protection, the dhimma, that's an Arabic word. As we've heard, non-Muslims are subjects of a Muslim state in which they have particular duties towards the state and particular sort of disabilities relative to Muslim citizens, which in return for which they get protection from the state itself, right? So the principles of this system were based on a document that maybe dates to the 9th century. It's called the Pact of Omar. It spells out these specific rules for how non-Muslims were supposed to relate to the Muslim state and society. Can you all see this? No? Let's see if we can kill some lights and make this better. Better? Better? All right. All right, so just as a few examples from the document that's sort of supposed to govern this system. So the non-Muslims are saying we shall not build in our cities or in neighborhoods new monasteries, churches, or convents. We won't manifest our religion publicly. We accept these conditions, and in return, we receive safe conduct. So the overall idea is you're supposed to keep non-Muslim religiosity out of the public sphere, sort of, right? Because Islam, again, in this pre-modern setting, is supposed to be the predominant religion of the state. So as long as, the notion is that as long as non-Muslims abide by this pact, okay, fine, you have sort of a place in the system. The actual application of these rules are going to vary a lot over time and place, but they're more or less always the basic guidelines. And this is true from the first emergence of Muslim states in the 7th and the 8th centuries, all the way down to the Ottoman Empire, sort of before the period of modern reforms. So rather than being, let's say, citizens with equal rights to other citizens of whatever religious standing, right, you're subjects in which your rights and duties are differential dependent on what your religion is. So this system gets drastically transformed, first by Ottoman reform movements that try to build a more inclusive civic identity that Dr. Roxinger, I do like saying that Dr. Roxinger told us about a little bit before. The Ottoman Rose Garden Decree here, commonly held up as being the beginning of this period, right, in which the Sultan tells his subjects that the Muslim and non-Muslim subjects of our lofty sultanate shall, without exception, enjoy our imperial concessions. So this gets sort of honed in on as a point at which the Sultan, right, is promising equal rights to the various religious groups of the empire. So this, again, this is a very schematic look at this, but the ultimate result of all these transformations that also lead up into the modern Middle Eastern state system is that non-Muslims go from the position of being subjects of differential rights to, ostensibly at least, citizens with equal rights to those of their fellow citizens. And this is a drastic, big transformation, right? This way of thinking about how non-Muslims are supposed to relate to the state has been simply unavailable, almost unthinkable in Muslim-ruled polities in the pre-modern period. Okay, it's also with this transformation that the idea of religious minorities starts to take on the sense in which we understand it today, and this is something that I'd emphasize also. You might want to leave those lights down because I'm going to have more text eventually, if that's possible. Can we leave the lights down? Is that all right for you out there? Yeah. Okay. So when we talk about, as we said, when we talk about these religious groups as quote-unquote minorities. It's implying that we're talking about demographics and the numbers of a population. And in the context of a modern state system, numbers matter, right? Because we're operating with the assumption that the conduct of a state's politics should somehow be representative of the population, right? That there should be some notion of popular sovereignty there. So minorities become minorities because they're different from the biggest part of a state's population, but they still have to be represented or accommodated by some manner in the state's governance. And this is really a very modern way to think about what a religious group is. Right, before the 19th century, before this period of reform, sovereignty, political power, they don't have anything to do with the population that's being governed or being ruled over. Sovereignty comes from dynastic pedigree, from religious supremacy, from right of conquest. So this question of demographic weight doesn't factor in before that. And you could compare it to the way we think about the Ottoman Empire and much of its history. Most of its subjects were Christian and not Muslim. But we never talk about it in terms of a Muslim minority state, but as a Muslim empire, right? Because we're operating with a different notion of sovereignty in that context. So, insofar as we now assume sovereignty to be popular in some sense, that gives meaning to the whole idea of religious groups as minorities. And that's something that's a point I'd emphasize here. All right, let's turn now to the 20th century history of Syria and look at a few figures and a few episodes as examples of religious minorities engaging with politics in this post-Ottoman world by embracing broader definitions, broader identities that stretch beyond their own communities. We'll also think in those terms about some of the reasons why these identities have sort of failed to build stable, workable states. So we can start with a native of Damascus who became one of the more influential Arab political thinkers of the mid-20th century. His name's Michel Aflaq. He was born in 1910, and he became a notable figure as one of the principal architects of Baathism. So, in a word, Baathism, this is an Arab nationalist political movement. It stresses the unity of the Arab peoples or the Arabic-speaking peoples, promotes the idea of a pan-Arab national state. So, in other words, in its theoretical formulation, this is a pretty classic nationalist ideology, stressing the common destiny and the sort of shared political sovereignty of a people who are defined along ethnic terms. So the notable thing here that I want to emphasize, you might have been able to guess, is that Michel Aflaq was a Christian. He's born into an Eastern Orthodox family that belonged to Syria's sort of urban merchant classes. And it's interesting for our purposes because it's representative of a way in which nationalism, in spite of the fact that it draws ethnic distinctions, right, and pushes out other ethnicities, proved attractive to a lot of religious minorities, and especially Arabic-speaking ones, within the Arab world in the mid-20th century because it smoothed out or claimed or didn't prioritize religious difference, right? I'll give you a little example here, a little piece from a famous speech that Michel Aflaq gave where he started talking about Islam. He says, the relationship of Islam to Arabism is not like any other relationship between nationalisms and religions. The Arab Christians will be aware of this when their nationalism reaches its complete awakening and they regain their true essence. Islam is their national culture and they need to saturate themselves with it so they can understand it and love it so that they protect Islam as they would protect the most valuable of the components of their Arab identity. So this is a Christian who's writing these words. But the important point that I'd stress here is that he's really rereading Islam as a sort of cultural heritage, right, rather than a religion. So this is, in this sense, and Arab nationalism in the mid-20th century had various fraught relationships with Islam as various ways, but this notion of Islam, it's no longer a religion here, but rather it's this cultural heritage that unites Arab peoples generally. This was something that non-Muslims could buy into, at least some could, because it could, again, give them as a platform for engaging in politics, right, as equal citizens. So the history of the Assad family in Syria is another good example of this. So the Assads have ruled Syria, or now what's left of it, since about 1970. And they're an example of an even more marginal religious minority that at first at least used Arab nationalism as sort of a platform to enter a broader political arena. So their roots lie up here in the mountains of sort of northwest Syria. And the Alawites were traditionally a pretty rural, pretty poor community. One of these examples of a sort of heterodox sect that finds some kind of solace up in the mountains. Now, as modern Syria took shape from the end of the Mandate period up until independence in 1946, Arab nationalism was very attractive for these kind of groups, again, as a platform in which to get involved in the broader politics of the state. So the Asseds came up through the military and through the Ba'ath Party. That is, they espoused a nationalist Ba'athist agenda, right? And were ultimately able to take control of the state on that platform. Now, at the same time, however, and in this we're looking forward a little bit, one of the long-term stories of the Assad Syria is that even though they start out with this Arab nationalist identity that downplays religious difference, Syria never institutionalizes any kind of inclusive popular politics. And as a result, it ended up being run de facto by an elite political military class that's overwhelmingly, or at least disproportionately, made up of precisely this one religious group, the Alawites, the people who are closely tied to the Asseds. So in practical terms, you've got a state run by a network of individuals with close ties to the Assad family. A lot of them have come from a similar Alawite background as the Asseds, maybe from some of the other smaller religious communities as well, and they've sort of worked their way through the institutions of a modern state to land on top of it. And this is a big irony in the experiences of religious minorities in modern Syria. Non-Muslims sort of asserted new roles for themselves in politics by embracing Arab nationalism because it de-emphasized religious difference, right? But the Asseds ended up ruling Syria through a network of these close allies, and that gave this sort of sense that it was simply a sectarian state on the face of it. So it's important to emphasize here that there was no ideological element to the Assad's Alawite, or to the fact that these Alawites had become the ruling political and military class, right? Sort of in a nutshell, if you want to ensure solid authoritarian control over your country, you're probably better off relying on your cousins and your friends from back home in order to do so, rather than, let's say, people from too many cities over. So it's not an ideologically sectarian state. But the effect of this practice of rule has been to slot certain religious groups disproportionately into certain classes of society, certain parts of the state. And what we've seen in the last 5 years is that when protests against the Assads sort of degenerated into violence since the beginning of the Arab Spring or the civil war in Syria, it made it all the more easier for Islamists, for radical jihadis, for radical Islamists to portray this as a conflict between the Sunni majority and this one sort of deviant sect, right? It's a movement that in many respects starts out as the Syrian people versus an authoritarian government, but because of the way the Assads have ruled Syria, certain people with certain interests have been able to cast it as a sectarian conflict and then essentially turn it into a sectarian conflict at the same time, because the fighting has ended up breaking down along these religious lines that the Assads sort of de facto institutionalized. How am I doing on time? 5 minutes? Okay. I'd also want to turn then quickly to Lebanon. Here's the Hafez, the founder of the dynasty, if you want to call it. That's the older son who was supposed to succeed him and then crashed his car and died. And that is the other son who was an ophthalmologist who then got called on to rule Assyria that he was never supposed to rule in the first place. Okay, I'd like to talk one other response to these modern political changes in the Middle East. We can take Lebanon as a case here, in which the Maronite Christian group embraced a much more particularist identity. Rather than going towards sort of broad-based Arab nationalism, Maronites embraced a particularist Lebanese nationalism that was based much more closely on their sense of themselves as an exceptional group, different from the broader sort of Arab and Syrian world in which they lived. The reasons for that are the reasons that the Maronites them specifically sort of caught on to these kind of ideas. There's a lot of reasons for that we can talk about in the Q&A if we want. But I would just want to emphasize that that was sort of a different way that religious minorities could, again, engage with sort of new opportunities for political action in the middle of the 20th century. And whereas Syria's the Assads in Syria sort of de facto institutionalized religious difference, in Lebanon, the system was set up so that sectarian difference and religious difference was made simply part of the state. That is, Lebanon, since its founding, or rather since its independence, has been ruled by a parliamentary system in which certain numbers of seats are earmarked for certain religious groups within the country. The idea is it's supposed to be an inclusive model of government by making sure that everyone is properly represented, but ultimately it's had the effect more of, again, institutionalizing and sort of hardening the barriers between different religious groups, because anyone's given sort of stakes in the political system are dependent on their religious identity. In other words, if when you're voting for a spot, you're not choosing from, if you're voting for a parliamentary seat, you're not just choosing from a big range of, a big list, but you're voting simply within your confessional community. That's, again, making the confessional community, sort of turning it into a political faction in and of itself. And Lebanon fought a bitter civil war from 1975 to 1990. And I guess the point that I'd like to close on here to mention about that is that episode of sectarian violence at the time, some observers talked about ancient hatreds between Christians and Muslims, inevitable conflict in a setting like that. But what I want to emphasize is that very frequently in the modern Middle East, sectarian fighting, violence between multiple religious groups, has really often been the product of when religious belonging gets married to the institutions of a modern state. And that's really what happened in Lebanon. In Lebanon, we had this proportional representation system, but they never modified how the proportions were distributed. So as demographics changed, and as Muslims in the country came to outnumber Christians over the course of several decades, the system no longer worked, no longer sort of properly represented the population in that sense. And at that point in time, the whole system and power within it were up for grabs. And because this system of confessional representation, again, had sort of turned religious groups into political factions, that's how sectarian conflict and the war were fought. They were fought along those lines. So that's a final point I'd like to make in this about the nature of sectarian and religious violence in the modern Middle East, is that in many ways it's very modern, a very modern phenomenon, which is not to say that there was never violence between religious groups. There often was. It happened quite a lot. However, the way it's played out in modern states has quite a lot to do with the way modern states are built, and not simply because these religious differences have been there for centuries and conflict among them is inevitable. So I think I'm about out of time at this point, and I will leave it at that, and we can talk some more about these topics in the Q&A, as well as current immediate conditions if you're interested. Let's see if I can get to Let's go to a demographic map. All right.
Jennifer Jolly from Sebastian, Florida. So as you were talking about Lebanon, that's something that I did not know about their structure and their political structure in parliament, their seats. So if I understand this correctly, non-Muslims are given seats within parliament, correct? Now, how does this compare to other Middle Eastern states in the area, such as Iran?
So in Iran, I believe there are a few small seats designated for some of the non-Muslims. I don't know if, yeah. Iraq has a few. Iraq also, the current parliamentary system also designates certain seats. The thing about Lebanon is that it's a vastly mixed state. There are tons of different smaller religious groups, multiple kinds of Christians, Druze, Alawites, Sunni Muslims, Shiite Muslims. So you have this real serious diversity, right, within Lebanon. And the thing is here that you only really can vote for someone within your own confession, right? And that's what really makes it a institutionalized confessional system in that way. And when it's first implemented, when it's first put in place, the Maronites managed to get Lebanon turned into a separate country, essentially because they have good relations with the French. And when the French are trying to come up with a good way to rule their mandate states, right, after World War I, they kind of patronize their their Maronite allies and give them this state where the Maronites are supposed to be the strongest and not the majority, but the plurality community. And the way the seats are initially set up is at a 6-to-5 ratio in the parliament, 6 Christians for every 5 Muslims. The president of the country has to be a Maronite. That takes a few years to get that worked out, but the president has to be a Maronite. The speaker has to be a Shiite, and the prime minister has to be a Sunni. I think I have those right. So it's set up in order to privilege one specific religious group ultimately. And these charts are the guesses at how the demographics of the country have changed over the decades. And so for a variety of reasons, demographically, different Muslim groups came to really outnumber Christians in this setting. And that makes the system, and then the other factor is that there are also Palestinian militants operating within Lebanon. You throw all this together, and the system doesn't really work. But it's also hardened the lines between these different communities, and that's how you fall into civil war then.
Pardon the intrusion, but we're going to take the opportunity to make a PSA for a new interactive infographic which FPRI launched last week, which looks at electoral systems in the Middle East. And so the interactive portion teaches you about specific types of electoral systems, and then there are 4 country studies, one of which is Lebanon, which looks not only at the specific manifestation within those particular countries, but also looks at, in the Lebanese case, failures of attempt to reform the system because of the reasons that Lev had talked about. So you can find that on FPRI's website, and it's meant to be a pedagogical tool and for simply interested citizens. So the countries that we currently cover are Lebanon, Israel, Turkey, and Jordan. And we are hoping to add to it. It's by our junior Fox Fellow, Tamar Friedman. So please visit it on our website, and we'll add a lot more color and definition to what Lev has just alluded to.
I'll throw another pitch here. I don't know if you will find this useful for teaching, but if you look at the first 2 elements of the Lebanese constitution originally adopted in 1926, it really sort of illustrates these competing ideas of what Lebanon is supposed to be between the Christians who are interested in this particularist identity and other groups within this country that are interested in a much more, or trying to be part of a broader Arab nationalist tradition. So this first one, Lebanon is a sovereign, free, and independent country. It's a final homeland for all its citizens. It's unified in its territory, its people, and its institutions within the boundaries defined in this constitution and recognized internationally. Okay, so Lebanon is Lebanon. It's this one thing separate from others. B, Lebanon is Arab in identity and in its association. It's a founding and active member of the League of Arab States and abides by its pacts and covenants. So here you can see it's this dispute within Lebanon between people interested in a particularist way to go and people who are more interested, especially among Muslims, in trying to get involved in a broader Arab nationalist politics. And so you can kind of see the contradictions and the difficulties in the population of the state right there in the Constitution.
I had a question about minority immigration. It seems that there are about, what, a 250,000 Yazidis in Germany, along with 2 million Turks. And it seems the Yazidis who had been in the Kurdish areas were not necessarily getting along either with the Turks because of the circumstance. And now Alawites are now demanding to go to Germany. They're not even willing to settle in other places on the way. It seems a little bit odd that so many groups in conflict with each other would be headed for the same spot. Because they're going to Berlin for the most part.
Well, I think that probably speaks to the point that people, especially religious minorities who are caught in between these much bigger forces and civil wars, are really generally interested in trying to get out any way they can in many ways. This was I don't want to end on too grim a note, but I do want to mention that generally speaking, the situation of religious minorities is very dire. Anywhere there's political instability and war, within the Middle East, it always tends to fall disproportionately, heavily in some sense on religious minorities, because they may not have as big a stake in either of the various combatants, because they often already have diasporas elsewhere in the world that makes the idea of emigration a little bit easier, right? And with the current instability between ISIS, between Syria and Iraq, Israeli occupation of Palestine, there's lots of religious minorities that have an interest in moving elsewhere. And this is part of, I think, Dr. Berkey's, the beginning of his talk, he talked about how he sees the Middle East as going from a very diverse place to a much greater degree of homogenization over the course of the last 100 or so years. And that, I think, is really part of this is a big part of that story here.
Hi, Steve Katz, Community College of Philadelphia. Can you talk more about the Maronites? I believe they came in the 19th century. These were French Christian missionaries that came there. And also, I understand that they were pretty well-to-do. They were very successful businessmen. And that was one of the reasons why Lebanon was doing very nicely until, all this started. For example, Beirut was considered the Paris of the Middle East, and there was prosperity and all that. Is that fairly accurate?
So, yeah, so Beirut, before the Civil War, of course, has this kind of romantic image of it as Paris of the Middle East. This is dependent on a few things. Economically, it was very liberal, which made it very easy for a whole lot of international business in various ways to go through this area. And so that kind of internationalism was part of that reputation. Again, it's an extremely diverse place. And Beirut ended up being being this cosmopolitan center where all these different groups, various classes, various religious groups, all did live in this setting together. I don't want to get too romantic about an idea of a Paris of the Middle East, right? Because this is all happening while at the same time there are all kinds of other constituencies within Lebanon that don't see their voices as being sort of properly addressed within this system, right? So in a certain sense, that's the other side of the coin to the sort of romantic picture of Beirut as Paris of the Middle East going on at the same time. And in recent years, Beirut has they've done a lot to try to sort of reclaim that mantle by sort of development projects and everything within the city itself. As far as the Maronites, so there are very important reasons why the Maronites in particular would get interested, again, in thinking of themselves as a kind of special, distinct group as opposed to the greater Arabic-speaking population. And it has to do with the fact that they're a mountain population for a long time, so that, right, sort of encourages a bigger degree of maybe insularity, but it's certainly thinking of yourself as a specific and closed population. And very early on, they have contacts both with the Vatican and with French missionaries, and then later diplomats and other sort of imperial agent types. They actually, after the Crusaders come, way back in the 12th century, the Maronites set up contacts with the Vatican and start to recognize the Pope. So they have this very early tradition, again, of doing something different than other Christians in the region do, and therefore thinking of themselves as separate. And because they have this Catholic link, once French missionaries and French merchants and other French travelers start coming into the region, they'll often start using Maronites, and other Christians as well, but Maronites especially, as translators or as sort of diplomatic agents and such. And that's a big process, that's a big part of building this idea of they're something different because they have those kind of external contacts. Does that answer your question?
I had a couple questions about the Druze in Israel. I recognize that they're different from the Daliat Carmel to the Golan Heights, but I found it very interesting when you were talking about mountainous areas, because those are both separately mountainous areas.
Mm-hmm.
But if you could explain a little bit about, I realize the ones from the Golan Heights reject, a lot of them have rejected Israeli citizenship. If you could talk about the difference between those two groups and what their current right status is. Thank you.
I mean, those Druze, the Golan Heights, right, is conquered from Syria as a result of the 67 war, right? So to that point, they've been Syrian citizens. And there were many Druze who also had a certain stake in the Arab nationalist project in Syria. Much like the Alawites, they sort of disproportionately could go into military academies or used military academies used the military as an institution to try to move into the mainstream of politics. These are populations that to this point in time, up to the modern nation state, have been involved in the politics of their regions, but less so in the broader functioning of the state. So some Druze had a big stake in the or had an interest in being seen as Syrian citizens and part of broader, Arab nations, and that's why they may not have been so interested in taking Israeli citizenship after those territories are conquered. Was there another part of your question?
I'm curious about the other Druze, because they are in the army and they're different from Palestinians. They're completely different. So, and they have adapted to the majority for many generations.
It's possible someone in here might be able to speak to this a little bit better than I can. My best understanding of that would be that these are the populations, the Druze populations that fell and came as part of Israel and had been in the parts that became Israel already in 48 when the state was founded. So earlier on, there were some complicated conflicts I'm not going to get into between Palestinian groups and Druze groups at those points in time, and the Druze ultimately ended up saying we're going to go with Israel and sort of take this somewhat exceptional but accepting position within this new state. Is that, Sam, is that close enough? Yeah.
Syria. So if you're a Druze up in Syria, you want to seem loyal to Assad because you don't want to take Israeli citizenship, serve in the Israeli army, and then find yourself in Syria.
Yeah. So, and on the on those suggested resources lists that I don't know if you've taken a look at these yet, but there's this Israeli movie, The Syrian Bride, which is some of you have seen this, right? Precisely about religious minority caught between different national borders in this modern nation-state system, and this is a good way to illustrate the conflicting loyalties that come about because of that.
There's actually a really good coming-of-age book about the Dalia Druze, too. That is it's the first Druze person of feature-length film in Israel. They're their own. They're not
They break off from the Shiites, but a long time ago, and their doctrines and their holy scriptures are distinct enough that they don't really have close associations with what we think of as Shiites now. So.
I think there were a couple of groups you didn't talk about, and I was wondering if you could just say a word or two about them. You didn't say anything about basically Southern Arabia. You didn't say anything about Oman, Ibadis, Houthis, Zaidis. It's because it's in the news right now, and people might be asking about it, especially with regard more to Yemen than to Oman. If you could just say a few words about, what the Zaidis are and Houthis and Ibadis and that kind of stuff, I think it would, just as a footnote.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. So, in Oman, the actual sort of majority Muslim religion there is the Ibadis, which is another older, they're kind of, if you want to think of Sunnis and Shiites as two ways, the Ibadis are a third one that is much smaller than either of the other two. There are some Ibadis also in modern Algeria. And in Oman, that's the state form of Islam there, right? The Zaidis, I'll say a little bit about the Zaidis in Yemen and the Houthis down there. So the Zaidis, this is another Shiite group. This one maybe gets called Fivers, but they don't really need to get called Fivers. They're another Shiite group. Different from the one, theologically, historically, really pretty different from the one that predominates up here. But historically in Yemen, they were sort of the ruling class in Yemen and made up the elite of the country. They were especially well established in the tribal mountain populations of Yemen up in the north of the country. And so from there, they were the political ruling elite then, down when you got down into the lowlands and other parts of Yemen. And that's the historical setting. And the Houthis are a Zaidi Shiite group that is currently one of the various factions in a pretty complicated conflict, basically for control of the state within Yemen right now. The Saudis very much do not like the Houthis, the Zaidis, and they may be developing and have developed certain links with Iran and Shiite powers elsewhere. Historically, there's really not a lot of connection between the Shiite groups down here and, again, the bigger ones up here. But that's what I'll say about the Zaidis for now. Again, yeah, you can see how I had to sort of pick and choose exactly who I was going to talk about.
I have a question here. Right here. To what extent have regional and global powers used the minorities in Lebanon to advance their agendas? And what is the potential of another civil war happening in Lebanon? Or will what is happening now in Syria go to Lebanon as well?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think, like many people, have been astonished that Lebanon hasn't fallen apart yet because of what's happened in Syria. I think that's a testament to the civil interests of a lot of people in Lebanon who don't want to see a repeat of what happened before. I mean, once the civil war in Syria started, I'm not good at political predictions, but I would have almost thought that would, it was inevitable. And I think it's a really good question about the role of foreign powers in having to do with religious minorities and in the Middle East. And something that I would emphasize, and this goes back to the question about Maronites and their relationship with the French. You hear frequently the whole, and this is something Dr. Garfinkel talked about also, the notion that, the British and the French, these colonial powers, they impose these arbitrary state borders on the Middle East. The thing is that to a certain extent, state borders in the modern world, these are always arbitrary, right? This is what Dr. Reynolds was talking about also. You're never going to have a perfectly homogeneous population in order to, that you can put perfect borders on. So focusing on that is a little bit misleading. But to me, what is a much more pernicious long-term effect of French and British colonial or imperial rule within the Middle East is the degree to which they tended to use certain minorities as kind of favored middlemen or and also as troops in their armies, which again had long-term had an effect of again hardening those boundaries between those populations and the majority religious communities. And it's not the only factor, but it's one of the factors that has made sort of nationalist inclusive state building difficult, especially in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, all the territories that were formerly French and British mandates. So the French had this very close relationship with the Lebanese, or with the Maronites down here, but they also sort of actively recruited Alawites and Druze for their mandate colonial armies because it was made ruling easier if you have this sort of middleman position. And the British at various points did similar things with Assyrians and other groups in Iraq. And we don't want to minimize the interests of these groups themselves in having some kind of autonomy, of having some kind of political future of their own. But the fact that they were sort of used in a particular way in colonial systems of rule has had one of the factors that's led to these after effects, I think, down the decades.
Hi, I have one last question. My name's again John Larkins. My question is about Iran and the way the Islamic Republic there might see its involvement. I know it is involved with the protection or connections to Shia groups in the region, but how Iran and its state might see itself in terms of PR campaign maybe as an alternative to the Sunni jihadi view of, being in the minority, we're a little more likely to be respectful or have another way to approach the Maronites or the Assyrians or the other peoples that might be on the borders or around their influence.
So I don't know of any way in which the Iranian regime is really interested in making sort of PR claims to being friendly to minorities in a way like that. Certainly not in sort of an active ideological sense. And I mean, Iran has extremely close relations, with Hezbollah, the militia and political party in Lebanon, and their interests are tied up together, And Iran they have a big role in perpetuating any kind of conflict there, and they have one side that they're on. I mean, I think you could, with a certain kind of détente that has potentially developed between Iran and the United States. And I don't want to talk too authoritatively about this because I really can't. But the fact that because ISIS is so bad and nuclear negotiations, right, have started to open these certain kinds of, a certain kind of different relationship between the United States and Iran. I mean, they almost sort of de facto have found themselves in a position where they don't look like the worst, the most extreme Islamists on the block. But as far as the sort of active policy of saying we're friendly to minorities, I'm not terribly well acquainted with something like that.
Shar Weigel from Philly area. Sort of a variant of that, but from a different angle. I'm wondering whether you have any information on kind of public opinion and attitudes in the face of ISIS. Is there kind of a hardening of opinion against the other that could spill over into some of these religious minorities? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, so you mean because of ISIS that some religious minorities are going to like others less at this point, or?
Sorry. Sort of a hardening against the other,
Yeah.
and a retreat into the majority religion in a given area.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to speak to like real public opinion, especially in a place like Syria right now, where obviously, I mean, you can't do that kind of research. I mean, but many Christian groups in the Middle East feel like they're under siege from all kinds of different angles. I mean, and emigration, there have been high levels of Christian emigration from the Middle East for decades at this point, and they're only getting higher. And I'm fairly pessimistic about how any of this is going to turn out. And so certainly, I think a lot of these groups really feel like their existential and both their physical and cultural existence in the region really might cease to exist, and some of them might just have to deal with this. I mean, what's happened to the Christians of northern Iraq is absolutely horrific and terrible. I mean, both their cultural and physical presence, it's been ethnically cleansed from a lot of these regions. And if you look in Syria, early on in what happened, as the conflict and the Arab Spring began in Syria, Christians were on a lot of different sides. There were always Christians who were always nervous about the fall of the Assads, because they said, look, at least they keep radical Islamists out of the picture. But there were also Christians who were strongly opposed to that authoritarian government. At this point in time, my guess would be that that range of opinion has narrowed considerably. I think just 2 or 3 days ago, I saw that one of the Melkite bishops, or one of the bishops of Aleppo, called for further support for Assad. I mean, at this point, ISIS, looks very strongly like the much worse alternative to many of these communities, and it's understandable why.
Just as a sidebar, there is another kind of minority being created as a result of ISIS, and that is, for the first time, you actually have some vocal Muslim by civilization atheists having a very, very funny reaction in Saudi Arabia and in Iraq. You now have a lot of people saying, if this is what Islam is, if this is supposedly some pure or form of Islam, then I want anything to do with it. And you're now beginning to get real pushback in some places against these excesses. So you've got another layer of intra-Muslim pluralization, all the way to agnosticism and atheism. Now, there have always been atheists, especially in a country like Saudi Arabia, because when you try to jam religion down people's throat the way the Saudi ulema do, you're going to get reactions from some thoughtful people, but they used to just shut up about it. Now you actually have people who are willing to say, in some of these countries, that they don't believe in God, they don't believe in religion. This is new. This is new. So you've got this very weird, sort of unanticipated reaction from these excesses of recent years. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, I would add to that mid-20th century, when there were plenty of Marxists also in the Middle East at that point in time earlier, I would say that earlier phases of history, there were the atheists and the agnostics there too. I wouldn't call it 100% new in that way, but yeah, the point is well taken.